even as the Russia-Ukraine conflict is heading towards a bloody denouement, final crescendo, we have inklings of another conflict on the horizon, and this is a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The trillion-dollar question today is not if China will invade Taiwan, but when will China invade Taiwan. The Chinese leadership has painted itself into a corner. They have been talking of Taiwan for decades. Xi Jinping, when he started his tenure, had made it a point of honor that he would integrate Taiwan, whether by peace talks or by force, and he did not rule out the use of force, etc. So he has been extremely keen to do it in his time, and the Chinese also think in historical time frames of 100 years of communist rule and all that. So before that, they want to integrate their so-called renegade Taiwan province. Now the simple fact of the matter is that if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was preoccupied by the serious tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States over the stationing of missiles in Cuba, and a major nuclear flashpoint had occurred, and there was a global crisis, the world seemed to be teetering on the edge of the Third World War. That is the time Mao Zedong's China had decided that the world was too preoccupied, and this was the right time to teach India a lesson. And they did precisely that. They attacked us in 1962, an unprepared India, more concerned with peace rhetoric, Panchashil, Ahimsa and the rest of it, and neglecting its own defenses as a nation state. They taught us a very bitter lesson, and they attacked. They exploited the larger conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. They saw a window of opportunity, they took it, and they humiliated us in 1962. It's another matter that the world has come a long, long way. A lot of water has flown down the Brahmaputra since then, and now the situation is quite the opposite on the India-China front. But what I'm alluding to is China's attempt to mask its attack in the penumbra of another major global conflict. So by all logic, the Russia-Ukraine war actually had presented a golden opportunity to the Chinese that they could exploit this conflict, the preoccupation of the United States, to attack Taiwan. This was actually, from the geopolitical context, one of the best chances that they would ever have had. The point at issue was the PLA ready? The PLA has been speeding up its military build-up. We just had on 1st of August the anniversary of the People's Liberation Army, when once again Xi Jinping exhorted the PLA to speed up its mobilization, its military build-up, and be ready to carry out the orders of the Chinese government in terms of capturing Taiwan. The fact is, what was the Chinese time frame? What will be the Chinese time frame? Right? A lot of people were saying it would be around 2007 that they would have their third aircraft carrier floating. They would have done up their naval amphibious assault capability. They would have added more number of nuclear warheads. They have about 350. They want to stretch it to 1,500. So I'm sure they have the nuclear fissile material, and they're trying to rank up that production of warheads. Then there is the question of their rocket forces. What the Russia-Ukraine war has shown so clearly is that the decisive weapon of war has been, one, the missile forces, the tactical ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles, the hypersonic missiles, right? And the second, the drones, and the even more important than the drones, the artillery. Now, China's problem is that it is not an attack across land like the Russia's attack on Ukraine. The logistics are far, far simpler there. And even there, the Western agencies are claiming that the Russians had serious logistical problems. Whether it is propaganda or the truth remains to be seen. I think after the war, when the dust settles down, we'll be able to get more to that aspect. But the fact of the matter is the Chinese have to attack across 80 miles of the sea, the Taiwan Straits. You see, so their logistical problem is a far greater nightmare. And a risk-averse establishment, for them to take for them it is very clear that an assault on Taiwan is a very high risk, high political and military risk venture that if done prematurely could end in failure and fiasco and worse. Now, the Chinese leadership has shown itself to be very risk-averse. This is not Mao Zedong's leadership. That was aggressive. They had been fighting 30 years non-stop in the Civil War. Then they gave a bloody nose to the Americans in Korea. Then they went and launched a brutal counter-insurgency campaign in Tibet. And that combat hardened against the Khampas and that combat hardened army that hit us in 1962. Well, I mean, the results were there for all to see. We were on to, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai and Panchashil and Ahimsa and what have you. And here was an army which was, hell bent on teaching us a lesson, and they did. And they did. So the fact of the matter is that we have to now understand that the Chinese timeline will be one dictated by their military preparations primarily. The fact is, are they speeding up their military preparations? What are the current indications? That is the million or the trillion-dollar question. Now let me take it up a little more matter of factly. Simple fact is, why were the Chinese deterred from exploiting this famous window of opportunity of the Russia-Ukraine war? Any strategic calculus would tell you this was the ideal window of launch, which the Chinese seem to have missed. So if they missed it, why did they miss? The Chinese are very prudent, very cautious, especially the present leadership. Right? They may talk aggressively. Wolf warrior diplomacy is one thing, but when push comes to shove, they are extremely cautious for the simple fact that the PLA has not fought a war in the last 40 years. The last war that the PLA fought was in 1979 against the Vietnamese, and there they got a bloody nose. So I'm not very sure whether, a peacetime army is very keen to get into combat. It hesitates hell of a lot. It dithers and hesitates and, is almost always keen to make shows of force and coercive deployments, etc., but it always stops well short of actual war or crossing the Rubicon. So the simple fact is, why did the Chinese not exploit this window of opportunity? The answer is simple. At first, the Chinese waited and watched. Sensible, very sensible thing to do militarily. Wait and watch to see the outcome of the Russian offensive, to see how the Russians would fare. And then, based upon those lessons learnt, having ingested them, then go in for their own offensive. The initial Russian operations in Ukraine, I mean, we all know they were a bit of a, not a bit, but quite a come down. The Russians have a massive military reputation. They had taken Georgia in 2 days. They had taken Crimea in less than a day and without any opposition worth the name. And even the Americans were quite convinced that when the Russians attacked, they would attack in the classical Russian format, the classical Russian way of war, with heavy reliance on mass and heavy reliance on high tech. mass and high tech. First echelon, second echelon, third echelon. I mean, that is the old Soviet way of war, and artillery as the god of war. So they thought that it would be a walkover. The Americans thought, and therefore they were arming Ukraine with weapons that would help them to fight a guerrilla war a la Afghanistan, a la Iraq, against the occupying Russian army. The Americans had written off Ukraine before the war started. That is why they were supplying Stingers, which had been supplied in such huge numbers to Afghanistan. They were supplying TOW anti-tank missiles and a whole lot of NATO anti-tank missiles, Panzerfaust, what have you, to fight a guerrilla war against an occupying Russian army and bleed that army like the Soviet army that was bled in Afghanistan, etc., etc. So that was even the American calculation. Now, amazingly, Putin decided to go invasion light. He decided to follow the Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare. Gerasimov is the chief of general staff of the Russian army, and he had worked out this newfangled theory of hybrid warfare, how with a combination of Wagners and partisan forces and what you call your civil military forces, civil contractors like the Wagner, etc. With this combination, information warfare, electronic warfare, cyber warfare, media warfare, etc., you can give a knockout blow without having to use mass. So the smart thing to do was, don't mobilize fully, don't trouble the Russian people, do it light. And they were very sure they could pull it off. At least Putin seemed convinced. On the basis of what intelligence, we do not know. But his calculations were also not entirely fanciful. Zelensky had been elected, note this, Zelensky had been elected on the promise that he would have peace with Russia. So they thought that it just needed a bit of a hammering and he would come around and there would be peace. What the Russians did not realize is that peace negotiations had been held as a deliberate deception plan and as a mask to help the armament of the Ukrainian armed forces. After 2014, this effort by the Americans, by NATO, was really speeded up, and all Minsk I, Minsk II were a deliberate deception plot to somehow delay the Russian attack and give time to the Ukrainians to complete their military build-up. And by 2021, they were even talking in terms of the Ukrainians seizing the offensive and launching a major attack on the Donbass. It was to preempt that the Russians had no option but to do so. Even then they tried to delay the Russian operational, commencement of the Russian operation by again engaging them in peace talks. And the Russians missed the window of winter. They got into early spring. In February 22, it's spring, when the spring thaw comes in, the most wrong military season to launch a major offensive. But the Russians, with 150,000 troops, attacked a country with 250,000 troops to start with, and they had mobilized, brought it up to 500,000 troops, and there were, media reports to indicate that 700,000 men, not all armed, but had been mobilized by the Ukrainians. So it was a very skewed force ratio to start such an operation. Russians' aims were limited. They quickly achieved those limited aims. And then they thought they were knocking on the gates of Kyiv. That is the time we now learn that, Putin decided to, have a peace overture. The Turks mediated the talks. And Putin, as a goodwill gesture, he now says, decided to pull back his forces from the gates of Kyiv. What did he get? I mean, they poodle fake, they went through the motions of talks and then they said, Niet. And now Putin had already pulled out his forces from Kyiv. All this talk that the Ukrainians beat the hell out of the Russians is good propaganda, good information warfare. But there was no interference with the Russian withdrawal from Kyiv. They very cautiously followed up, and after the Russians had crossed over, did they take it back, and then they claimed victory, that we have bashed the living daylights out of the Russians and Moscow is about to fall, etc., etc., The long and short of this discussion is that now, in September last year, when the Russians mobilized, it came back to military common sense. All the hybrid war talk went out of the window, and now there is reality check. The military realities are different. 7th June, the Ukrainians launched their highly advertised counter-offensive, and they banged their head against a steel wall. They just battered their heads. They've been able to do nothing. They've been up and forth. The Russians decided to launch their counter-offensive. Americans saw them going in, asked the Ukrainians to attack with their 9 brigades, which had their Leopard 2s and the Challengers and the T-80s, etc., etc., the Bradleys and all that. And even the second wave of the attack has just been decimated by the Russians. So the Chinese are watching carefully. Initially, the Chinese were badly miffed. They were quite worried that if the Russians could not attack across, we are very combat hardened, they could not attack across a land border and make much headway. Attacking across 80 miles of the sea was a tall order, and quite obviously the hesitation and the hesitating elements in the PLA and the Chinese political hierarchy, they grew even more cautious. Seeing the fate of this, America was then in a phase of triumphalism. There was talk in Washington of a two-front war, that we are ready, whether it was deliberately put out as a propaganda ploy to prevent China information war offensive, to prevent China from exploiting this window of opportunity or otherwise. But the Americans actually pretended as if they could take on China and Russia together. And they threatened China that dare you arm Russia, dare you send weapons to the Russians. And then, to more or less humiliate the Chinese. When they found the Chinese pretty cowed down after the so-called bad showing of the Russian forces in Ukraine, when they found them very cowed down, there was hubris in Washington more or less. And there was triumphalism. I wouldn't call it hubris, but there was triumphalism in Washington. And then Nancy Pelosi went there to rub their noses in the sand, in the dirt, and then other people followed up because this was good photo op opportunities to humiliate China. And then we had the incident of shooting down the balloon. America seemed to be spoiling for a second fight, even while the first was on. Now the first fight is going badly. So what is the Chinese General Staff thinking? There is a churn in China. We find the Chief of Staff of the Strategic Forces, Rocket Forces, and the other 4 of them have been sacked. We found a very curious case of the protege, the foreign minister, him being sacked. Now, whether he was involved with some woman when he was ambassador in the United States or something, what the hell is going on behind the bamboo curtain? It looks like the Chinese are looking for some kind of a mole. It appears to them that somebody had leaked their war plans, etc., to Washington. And they are taking their back bearings, and they are, quite on a purge, on a Stalinist type purge, to purge any possible people who could have spilled the beans to the United States. Spilled the beans how? There seems to have been intelligence available in Washington that the Chinese were going to, now having watched the Russian offensive and now having quite regained their breath, because once the Russians started putting up a much better performance on the battlefield for the world to see, the Chinese General Staff seemed to have been quite convinced, no, we can do it. And we weren't very wrong. From the very beginning, after the Gulf War I, the Chinese have put a lot of emphasis on their rocket forces, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, Dongfeng 21 to hit the American aircraft carriers. I think they have gone the maximum way to do that. The Chinese have invested very heavily in drones. So the calculation of the Chinese General Staff is, we are absolutely on the right line. We were thinking right. Whatever are the lessons to come from this war, we were on that. The only lesson that they might have learnt is that instead of, cutting down manpower too hard and cutting your own tail and then howling and jumping, you have to go in mass. That is the clearest lesson that has come from this war. Not only high tech and mass. And high tech cannot permit you to cut down your manpower, which is the crazy notion that seems to be going around the world. The Americans spread it first, and we in India seem to have caught that contagion. Manpower is the biggest drag on any armed forces. They need to be thrown out, they don't have to be paid, etc., etc. We just need the weapons. Is Russia short of weapons? No. Why is it then? Why was it faltering? Because it lacked manpower. Now that it has got the manpower, you see the Russian showing has improved. Ipso facto, I mean, the military logic is crystal clear for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. You don't have to learn at your own cost, you have to see what is happening around. The Chinese are watching what is happening around, and they are quite clear we were on the right lines. So the orders were given to speed up this thing, and it appears that there was some whiff that the Americans got, that the Chinese had been insulted enough, they had been bullied enough, and at one stage I think that was perhaps the idea. One of the prime lessons of this war is that between offense and defense, defense now is the much stronger form of war with the latest increments in technology, drone technology, precision technology, etc., etc., and with satellites and battlefield transparency to the maximum. Launching an attack is very tough and a very tall order now, and you have to pay a heavy price. It is far easier to defend. So maybe the intention was to egg the Chinese into a premature attack and then to bash the hell out of them and make sure that for the next 10, 20 years they were licking their wounds. So was that the calculation? We do not know. We will have to wait and watch. But definitely there seems to have been some indication that the Americans got that the Chinese were now infuriated. That the Chinese, with Nancy Pelosi and the other visits and the needling and the kind of taunts that were given to them, I mean, they are an Eastern people, and loss of face is a very serious matter in China. So was Xi Jinping, he was so far waiting for his, third term to be, unprecedented third term to be confirmed. He is now confirmed, firmly in saddle, and now this needling has left him very, very red-faced, and I don't think he can afford it. He will have to show something, and so was there possibly some indication received that the Chinese were speeding up the timeline and they may go much sooner than everybody thought. The classical way to achieve surprise in war is to go before the rest of the world thinks you are ready. This is what Hitler had done in 1939. The world said he is not ready, he is not going to be ready for another 3 to 4 years. He attacked. And he quite obviously gained surprise. So one of the greatest factors in strategic surprise is that people are waiting for you to complete your military build-up. They are also watching your bean count go up by the day, and they've got their timelines based upon when you will complete your military build-up, you see. And the best way to achieve surprise is to do it before that military build-up is complete. So was there something of that sort? There are some very interesting things happening. Did the Americans get an indication that the Chinese were stung, humiliated, their nose had been rubbed in the sand quite hard, and they were now ready to go on the offensive? And does that explain the sudden American desire to placate China? From, triumphalism and hubris, we suddenly find a swing opposite in Washington. The Anthony Blinken making a beeline for China, the defense secretary trying to talk with the Chinese, and the Chinese stonewalling, etc. And then the treasury secretary goes there, Yellen goes there. And finally Henry Kissinger, an old China friend, he lands up to calm, soothe nerves in Beijing. Why? I mean, why the sudden turnaround from a very truculent, very aggressive posture? We can fight a two-front war, we can kick ass, both the Russians and the Chinese together and possibly somebody else also. And suddenly now there is a desire to placate China. So what gives? What's going on? Is it occasioned by the turnaround in Ukraine, the military turnaround, with the Russian Maginot Line working very, very effectively? Now you are really concerned with an unfinished business in Ukraine, and if a new business starts in Taiwan, and you are already short of ammunition, you have to give your entire cluster bomb munitions stockpile to the Ukrainians because the conventional ammunition is just not there. So you give them all the bomblets. That shows that you are short of munitions. And that's not a very happy state with which to start a two-front war. So I'm being very candid, and I am now led as a military analyst to wonder what's actually going behind the scenes. And now suddenly, were the Chinese placated? Did the Chinese wonder why this placation effort? Has our battle plans been leaked out? Then we suddenly find a purge in China. Across the board purge. Top political honchos like the foreign minister and Yang Yi being brought back from where he had been removed in favor of a wolf warrior protege of Xi Jinping himself. So he is under suspicion because he was in the United States and he had that so-called grand affair with that TV anchor or whosoever. He disappears from view. There are evasive statements given by the foreign ministry's spokesman, and now we have 4 Chinese senior generals of the strategic rocket forces, the strategic support forces, etc., all being purged, all this happening together. So are the Chinese taking back bearings to see who leaked out their plans? There is a lot that is happening behind the scene. There is a lot that is magma that is boiling below the surface. But if China is going to prepone its timeline for an assault on Taiwan, well, it has 3 options. One is a blockade option, and personally I think the Chinese, being risk averse, will go for the naval and air blockade option first. That way they get to defend and the others have to attack. Not across the land, but even at sea you have to then attack. The second option is the seizing a few islands. I don't think that is a practical option. What does that achieve? I mean, it's just कि मुझे गुस्सा आया है. It doesn't make sense. The third is a full-fledged invasion of Taiwan across 80 kilometers of sea, and Taiwan is a very hilly, rugged area, not very easy to attack, very easy to defend. So, yes, you could do it, but you'd pay a very heavy price, you'd risk failure and fiasco. And the greatest problem of China would be to deter, delay and defeat third-party intervention, which quite obviously is American intervention, possibly the Japanese and some NATO allies coming in. I'm not very sure how many NATO allies still have appetite for conflict after what's happening in Europe. But they could come in. And once that is over, it is India which will be left to face a very, very truculent and victorious China. The world has a great stake. That will not be a limited conflict. With third-party intervention, it will become more or less a global war. And if the Ukraine problem is still, flaring away, simmering away in Europe, with this, it is a full-fledged, what else is a third world war but this? And all but in name and declaration, you have a third world global conflict on your hands. So the point at issue is that 60% of the global chip manufacturing capability, semiconductor manufacturing industry is focused in Taiwan. Can the rest of the world afford to let this capability fall into the hands of an increasingly aggressive, truculent, and rising China? There is just no question. And some people are suggesting that the United States could go to the extent that if it felt that those capabilities, those semiconductor factories were about to fall into Chinese hand, the Americans would bomb them rather than sort of let them fall into the lap of the Chinese communists. Don't forget, in World War II, the British had bombed the French naval fleet after France had surrendered. They didn't want that fleet to now get into the hands of the Germans. So they themselves bombed their former allies, and they bombed the French fleet in Africa so that it would not be available to the Germans. So you may have to face such a scenario. That also explains the very, very definite American outreach to India. If we are going to go in for a situation where the war in Ukraine is going on full swing and a war starts in Taiwan and China joins the fray, and America has its problems with manpower, America has its problems with munitions, so fighting two wars is not a very good idea. That is precisely what Henry Kissinger had said. It should be a settled maxim of American foreign policy never to take on more than one major Asian power at a time. This is precisely what has been violated, and that is why Henry Kissinger himself, at 100 years of age, poor gentleman, he made a beeline to Beijing to talk to the Chinese, and the Chinese treated him with a lot of respect because he is the man who had made that famous outreach to China in 1971, and sort of, it was a strategic masterstroke of that era to split the communist bloc into Russia and China as now sworn enemies instead of allies, and that's why they welcomed him back. So that was part one. The Americans made a very, very significant outreach to India, not only in terms of giving us the weapons and equipment. We don't need the Americans to fight for us. India can take care of itself, even against China, Pakistan combined. What we need is technology. What we need is the weapons, and we want to make them in our own country and not be dependent on a foreign pipeline, which can be choked and snipped at the most crucial juncture. So while America was making an outreach to India, it was also making an outreach to China, I think almost as part of a firefighting. And the Chinese must have wondered why this outreach to us, why this turnaround, and that is why they possibly could have been taking back bearings. Who told them? Who told them? And that possibly explains the bloodbath in Beijing, the admirals being sacked, the generals being sacked, the foreign ministers being sacked. China is taking bearings on who leaked it out, where is the mole, who's the mole, etc. Don't forget, we also had a mole at the time of the 71 war, and he was supposed to be a minister of the realm. So this kind of a scenario is happening. Some very interesting things